Welcome to Passion for Sound, the channel dedicated to thorough and honest reviews of headphones, earphones, DACs, headphone amps, other components and accessories. Basically everything audio related except power amps and passive speakers. My name's Lachlan and my goal is to explore and discuss all kinds of audio topics, even the controversial ones, to help us all find more enjoyment from music. Thanks for watching and enjoy the video. Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. A little while ago now, I reviewed the Ollo S4X headphone, which is an open-backed studio monitoring, producing type headphone designed to be a pretty neutral response. Thanks to Guy over at Groove Central, I've now got a new Ollo headphone to share with you, being the Ollo S4R, which is their closed back and revised version of the headphone. Now I say revised, not meaning that it is a revision of the S4X. The S4X continues to exist, but the S4R is a new version of their closed back, and it's revised based on feedback they've received about the S4X. Now if you're getting confused, let me just clarify. S4R is closed back, S4X is open back. The S4R retails for €327, which equates to about $319 with straight conversion. I haven't looked into shipping or anything like that. And here in Australia, they'll retail for $649 Australian dollars. So there is a bit of a jump in price there due to things like import taxes, shipping costs, etc. But it's one of those things that we tend to be getting pretty used to now here in Australia. For this review, I'm going to put them up against the S4X, the open version, and also the Sennheiser HD560S to put them into context as how I think they perform as a mixing style headphone. But before we get into that, let's just take a look at what you get if you buy a pair of S4R. These are a 32 ohm, 111 decibel sensitivity headphone, making them very, very easy to drive. So you could run them from a smartphone if you wanted to, but of course the sort of headphone that they're designed to be means that they're often going to be running out of things like audio interfaces or general desktop DAC and amplifier combos. The good news is they'll run perfectly from any of those devices because they're very, very easy to drive. They'll also be revealing of things like hum and hiss from your sources in some cases, not to the degree of balanced armature IEMs, but I have found that these aren't so good with my Elekit TU8200R behind me here because they do show me the hum from the tubes. That might be a good thing if you're looking for an analytic headphone to really understand your source chain, but it also might go against you depending on your sources and your use for these. Given what they're designed for though, I think it makes sense that they're easy to drive from any type of device. One of the things I particularly like about the Ollo headphones, and this is true for the S4X as well, is that everything on them is replaceable by the user and upgradable in the future. So you can, in theory, if there is a version 1.2 of these in the future, these are called the 1.1 I should mention, so if there is a 1.2 in the future, in theory, depending on what's been changed, you could buy the parts that are different and install them yourself. So we've got a steel headband here with a synthetic leather strap that becomes the suspension band, and it is an elasticized strap. Now, as I mentioned in my S4X review, normally I'm not a fan of elasticized systems because they do wear out over time. But in this case, it's been specifically designed to be replaceable, so you can buy a new strap and install it yourself. The headbands are then attached to these American walnut cups. You've got some circular pads there with I'm guessing it's a synthetic leather on the outside, and a nice soft velour-y sort of finish against the skin surface. On the outer side of these cups, you've got solid metal plates. These metal plates are quite important to the design of the S4R because it means they're absolutely sealed and airtight. The reason that's important is if you're using these for any kind of vocal work, and you're using these as a monitoring headphone for vocal work, you're not going to get sound coming out of the headphone into the microphone. Mine sits just up here. You're not going to get sound coming out of the headphone and into the microphone and adding into the mix. Whether that's a backing track for a singer or whether it's just listening to the mix of a voiceover, you don't want to be having that extra sound adding in over the top of what you're trying to record. So that's a really important part of their design. What I was concerned about though was the fact that once you close off a headphone, you sometimes get unwanted resonance and some boominess and some interference with the general sound that's not necessarily as good as open back counterparts. Without giving too much away, I think they've done an incredible job with the S4R at managing closing it off and actually improving the sound above the S4X. Before I talk about the sound though, the one other thing I want to mention is there's been a change to the cable as well. So it's very similar. It still uses the red sections that connect to each of the ear cups. It still uses 2.5mm connectors, but what's changed is that rather than being a lighter weight cloth wrapped cable, it's now a slightly heavier rubberized cable. I'm not sure the reason for the decision on that one, but it's certainly a perfectly enjoyable cable to use. I had no issues with the S4X cable, but I do think this one does feel a bit sturdier and like I would be more comfortable using it as a workhorse compared to the S4X cable. Not a big deal though, I think either is fine. So now let's start talking about the sound quality of the S4R. One of the things that was very important to them with the S4R was to make it even more linear than the S4X. The S4X did bring a little bit of extra warmth to the sound. It made it sound just a little bit closed in and congested as well. And so one of the key focuses with the S4R was to get that more linear, neutral sound. According to the videos on the Ollo website, there was one trade-off made where there's a 7 kHz peak or trough, I think it was a trough actually, that they couldn't quite get rid of because of the need to keep this user serviceable. And so something about the machining of the housings was causing that issue at 7K, and they couldn't remove it without losing user serviceability. So there is a little bit of an irregularity around 7K, but according to their measurements, everything else is pretty much flat. And certainly to listen to them, I do believe that those measurements are accurate. The reason I'm questioning measurements or raising the question of measurements is that I had huge problems measuring these accurately on my mini DSP ears. I will show you the measurement below, but be aware that I don't trust it at all. I had to reposition the S4R over and over and over again to prevent a huge roll off in the bass that is definitely not true to the sound of the headphone. And in doing so, I discovered that I'm pretty sure there are all kinds of leaks going on because I couldn't get enough of a seal between the headphone and the surface of the ears. That's partly because the mini DSP ears have 4 screws right where the cups of the S4R are trying to seal, and I'm pretty sure that was a part of the problem. So I am sharing the measurements just so you can see them, but take them with many, many grains of salt. I don't trust them compared to what I'm hearing. And that's because what I hear from the S4R are an incredible neutral and linear response. These are the closest things I've heard to most studio monitors. And in fact, they're probably better than my studio monitors because they're not being affected by the room, the desk, and the general environment around them. The sound is neutral and it's clean and it's quite dry in a good way. What I mean by that is there's nothing being added to the music, there's no extra richness or lushness, it's just a really true and honest representation of what's coming through the source chain. And I think at this point it's probably worth reminding us what these headphones are designed for. These are intended to be headphones used by professionals mixing music. To do that effectively, they don't want extra coloration in the sound that might alter their mix and then have it sound wonky on an enjoyment-based setup of speakers, headphones, or earphones. The idea of having neutral studio monitors or headphones is that what you hear in the final mix is a true and accurate representation of what's going to come out at the other end. From there, it can be adjusted to taste, so if you want it to sound warm and rich and bassy, when it sounds warm and rich and bassy on these, it's going to on normal headphones and speakers. Imagine if somebody was mixing music on a pair of specifically bassy headphones. What they're going to put out at the other end is likely to sound lean on something that's more neutral. They've mixed something to sound right on something that might be boosting the bass by say 6 or 7 dB. And then you might be listening to it on something that only boosts the bass by 2 or 3 dB. All of a sudden, you're going to hear a much less bassy, punchy sound than what the mixing engineer intended. And so that's where these very, very neutral tunings are meant to work best, is in that sort of truth and honest representation so the producer or the mixing engineer can get the sound just right. And in that respect, I think the S4R are going to be a really great tool. It does mean they're not the most enjoyable listening tool. They're not bad to listen to, but they're not enjoyable or fun or engaging. They're just dead honest. So with that in mind and remembering what they're intended for, let's talk through their performance across the frequency range. Bass extension on these is really quite good, but the weight behind it is not great from an enjoyment perspective. I would like just a little bit more punch and weight in the bass if I was listening to these for fun. But from a mixing point of view, if I was using them to EQ my voiceover here just right, these would be absolutely great for that. I would know exactly when I was going too far with the bass and making things potentially sound too boomy, too thick and too muddy. I did find occasionally with the S4X that I was mixing things a bit lean because they were just a little bit thick to start with. Moving into the mid-range, I find the mid-range from these may be just a tiny little bit too forceful. And what I mean by that is compared to most headphones on the market, they do put a lot of energy into the mids. It's not thick or rich or lush. The emphasis I'm talking about is probably up in the 2 to 3K region, so it's right at that upper mid-lower treble area. And I think it's probably because what I'm used to hearing from most earphones and headphones, that's where they generally start to taper off. So these are probably again just right for mixing, but they're not quite as enjoyable for musical listening. That little bit of forcefulness I'm talking about is not major, it's not really unenjoyable. It's just something that I noticed in comparison to what I'm used to hearing with my headphones that are designed for enjoyment. Finally, the treble from these is really, really good. It's clean, it's bright to the right levels, it's well balanced with the rest of the signature. There's really nothing to complain about with the treble. In fact, all in all, the frequency response from these, as I've already alluded to, is absolutely excellent in the fact that it's very neutral and very linear across the board. One area though that these do fall down a little bit, and I think it's an area that would be helpful from a mixing point of view if it was a little bit better, is in the terms of soundstage. It's better than the S4X, which also wasn't very strong here, but they do have a relatively closed in and slightly, maybe not congested, but a soundstage that's lacking in space. Details and general placement of sounds in the soundstage is quite good, but the focus of the image is not particularly good. Layering of the image in terms of the depth of instruments behind one another is also not great, and the overall sense of space is pretty compressed to within the head. Again, from a listening point of view, that's not great. From a mixing point of view, it's going to make it difficult for a producer or a mixing engineer to place instruments around the soundstage effectively. But at the same time, they're probably not being used so much for that purpose. That's where using a set of studio monitors to give a proper sense of stereo imaging, that's going to be better for that sort of mixing. These are probably, I'm guessing, I'm no mixing engineer, but I'm guessing these are more useful for general monitoring and getting the balance of frequencies right, as opposed to actually producing the music and putting the sounds around the soundstage. So at this point in my listening and testing, I felt like the S4R were an outstanding option for a neutral, clean and relatively resolving headphone for mixing. To test that though, I put them up against a couple of other headphones that I've got here that are also intended for similar purposes. The most obvious place to start being their sibling in the S4X. So this is the S4X, the open back version, to which the S4R owe a lot of their upgrades. So this was an improvement on the old S4R, and now the new S4R, the 1.1 here, is an improvement on these. Of course, one is open, one is closed, so that might change which one you need or want, but the idea being that this has built upon a great foundation in the S4X. For all this testing, I was using the same track across the board, and it was specifically Changing of the Seasons by Anne Brun. Listening to that track on the S4X showed that it's got a much thicker sound, relatively speaking. It's still a fairly neutral sound, but it's not as pristinely neutral as the S4R. The S4X sounds a bit congested, a bit closed in, and a little tiny bit muffled in comparison. As I said, it's still a good headphone, it's just not as good as the S4R. The S4X has always sounded quite closed in despite being open as well, and interestingly enough, I found the S4R to sound more expansive and more open in its soundstage as a result of that better tonal balance. So out of the two of them, unless you happen to need an open design, I think the S4R are the clear better choice over the S4X. Now do keep in mind, there may be already a version 1.1 of the S4X that mirrors the changes applied to the S4R. I'm not entirely sure, I probably should have checked that before I did this review, but I didn't think of it until just now. So do check it out. If there's a new version of the S4X that matches the S4R in its sonic tuning, then both would be excellent choices, and it can come down to whether you want open or closed. If there isn't a new version of these, and what I'm holding here is the current version of the S4X, then you're probably going to want to choose the S4R unless you need open. To me, the S4R just get it almost perfect, maybe even perfect, in terms of producing a great mixing style headphone. But before I stopped there, I thought I'd better check them against a couple of other options. One of them being the much cheaper Sennheiser HD560S that I've reviewed here recently on the channel, because at just $200 US, they're a full $190 US cheaper than the S4R. They're also a true open back, so for those that are interested in an open back headphone for mixing and analytical purposes, I thought these might have been a good option. Comparing the two though, I felt like it was sort of a halfway point between the S4X and the S4R, in the sense that the HD560S here still felt a little bit congested compared to the S4R, but it was better and more spacious than the S4X. Where the price difference really shows up though is the treble from the 560S can get quite sibilant at times. The 560S would definitely be a good option for those on a budget, but if you've got the money to spend and you can use a closed headphone, there's definitely a huge benefit in going for the S4R. They're going to be very comfortable for extended listening sessions, both physically but also audibly or sonically, and they're also giving you a more neutral overall sound compared to the HD560S. The 560S does produce perhaps a slightly better sense of space in the sound, but tonally it's not quite as open and neutral as the S4R. So in other words, it throws a slightly better soundstage, but it doesn't have the sense of clarity around each individual sound that the S4R does. Hopefully that makes sense. The final test that I went for was with the Audeze LCD-1. I don't have the LCD-1s up on my desk, they're over behind me, but the LCD-1s are another headphone designed and marketed towards people looking to mix and master music. They're an open back planar magnetic headphone that I reviewed recently here on the channel, and they're priced almost identically to the S4R. In comparing the two, what I found was that the LCD-1 is more comparable to the S4X, meaning that it's got that slightly more closed in, congested sound, and it's harder to hear kind of through the mix, if you like, than it is with the S4R. The S4R gives me a lot more clarity and individual understanding of each instrument and the overall mix than either the S4X or the LCD-1s. I also found the tonal balance of the LCD-1 to be just a little bit off, with things coming across a bit nasal sometimes with them. So again, having gone through multiple comparisons, as well as just listening to them in isolation, I'm really confident now in saying that I think the S4R are a fantastic headphone and a wonderful evolution of the Olo brand. I know I've already said it, but I'm going to reiterate it again. If you don't need an open back headphone, I think the S4R are probably one of the best, if not the best, production style headphones that I've heard to date, particularly compared to the S4X, HD560S and LCD-1 that I've just tried. Now I do have a set of DT1990 Pros coming from a friend of the channel, so I will be reviewing those soon, and they might stack up pretty well because I know they're often seen as a professional's headphone for mixing and mastering use. So do stay tuned for that one. Make sure you hit subscribe if you're interested. But for now, just know that the S4R does tonal balance incredibly well, it does general separation of sounds incredibly well, and the only areas that I think it falls a bit short that may or may not be an issue for mixing and mastering music is in the sense of soundstage size and absolute razor sharp image focus. The image focus is okay, maybe slightly better than okay, the soundstage is pretty mediocre. So if those things aren't a huge issue for you and it's all about tonal quality and tonal balance, then I think the S4R are an absolute great choice. If the S4R sounds interesting to you, I'll put a link down below through to Groove Central here in Australia as a way of saying thank you to them for providing the review sample. There's no kickbacks or affiliates there, it's just a thank you. I'll also put a link through to the Olo website for those of you who are elsewhere in the world. If you found this review useful, I'd love it if you'd hit the subscribe button and the like button to make sure that you see more reviews in the future just like this one, and also to help share this review with other people like you. For now though, I'll leave it to the music, so happy listening and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.